Welcome, one and all. We are back and continuing our exploration of Warhammer Quest from 1995. We are doing the fourth of our starter heroes, and this time we're going to be taking a look at that very awesome stalwart of the dungeon. It's the Dwarf. Now, dwarves are an interesting character to play. You know how I said previously you've got like characters who naturally gravitate towards those who see themselves as the hero in a story. Dwarves kind of are the opposite. They're a kind of silent, effective, and just highly patient version of that kind of character. If you were playing Warhammer Quest within your family, you would if you were the elder brother, you would play the dwarf because the dwarf covers up a lot of the weaknesses of the other characters. What the dwarf loses in terms of flashiness, it more than makes up for with stoicism, toughness, resilience, and just sheer outright dependability. Dwarves in Warhammer Quest they play much like you would expect. They are extremely resilient and they are incredibly effective with a few bits of armor stitched on. In the beginning, most characters aren't the most heavily armored. Dwarves have their own natural toughness to boost their starting stat. Plus, they begin with a small amount of armor on already. And then make your first complete foray into the dungeon and then head to the nearest town to outfit yourself further. And what you will find is that dwarves rapidly become tanky powerhouses that can really take a ton of abuse and dish it out as well. Now, that point I made about dwarves being suited to slightly older players is because a certain amount of patience is required if you're playing the dwarf. If you're sticking to rules as written and not sharing out gold equally, or basically agreeing to spend it where it has the most impact for improving your party. If you're choosing to play Warhammer Quest in its original form, where everyone's kind of in a mini competition to try to get as much gold as they can, then the dwarf tends to lose out in this because the dwarf has the lowest initiative out of the entire party. The barbarian will tend to go first because he is the default party leader, and if he chooses to hold on to the lantern, it just means that he acts first, followed by the elf, who is always really going to be very, very quick with his high initiative. Then the wizard, who is just a bog standard human in terms of speed, and then finally the dwarf will act last. Why this matters is because you'll find that at least in the early few dungeons, the other quicker characters tend to hoard all the kills, and the poor dwarf is left on cleanup duty. And you'll find, generally speaking, that the dwarf levels up a little bit slower than other party members. If you choose to play the dwarf, or choose to play Warhammer Quest as originally intended, as a party of 4 heroes coming together but not necessarily collaborating to share the spoils. So it's an interesting conundrum to be in, because while the dwarf generally levels up a little bit more slowly than the other characters because he is always last in line to get gold, he also has the potential to become an absolute monster in close combat. Not only is he going to be tough, but he's got a tendency to become extremely hard-hitting in close combat because he can upgrade his axe, his family axe, to be absolutely studded with death-dealing runes. And this is something that every party, although it won't realize it immediately, ultimately wants to try to achieve, because as you gear up towards facing harder and harder monsters, you'll find that you really need the dwarf's killing power to stop enemies in their tracks. So the dwarf is really a character that it's in the entire party's interests to try to level up as soon as they can, because dwarves get extremely resilient and effective as fighters. Plus, they are one of the 2 characters, so the other character being the barbarian, who can wear a sizable amount of armor. In fact, the dwarf can wear armor. I mean, it makes sense, right? The dwarf can wear armor in a way that doesn't compromise his ability to move. He doesn't lose movement points, therefore he makes arguably the best use of armor. and he fulfills an essential purpose of being a dwarf tank, as you would expect. But in addition, his family axe basically allows him to have an interesting spike in damage. He might not quite have as many attacks as a barbarian, right? Or nor does he necessarily have the ability to move, even despite, move freely despite lots of enemies the way the elf can and so on. Certainly doesn't cast spells. But the dwarf absolutely can create a monstrous spike of damage if he happens to roll a 6. The way it works is if you roll a 6 for damage for a dwarf, he's basically given his opponent an almighty two-handed thwack, and as a result, you're doing double damage. Well, you're adding an additional d6 is the better way to put it. So your dwarf can be capable of a massive spike of damage when it matters. He's one of the few characters that can absolutely brain a Minotaur when needed, and you'll be really happy to have the dwarf functioning and healthy alongside your party members for when the time comes. So dwarves, absolutely a stalwart of the party. There are very few characters who can tank abuse the way a dwarf can. You just need to get a player who's patient enough to basically, level up his character as is, or as is the case with my regular gaming group, you can just decide to share the spoils of victory, which I guess in our old age we kind of favor as a solution, simply because we're not really in the game for competition. We're there really to try to explore these Warhammer Quest stories together. So what we do is we just go, cool, we just share out the money. If the dwarf has the best upgrade when it comes time to look at leveling up from one level to the next, then absolutely we will level up the dwarf. And our dwarf has gotten mighty, absolutely mighty. In fact, he's the one character that's kind of running away with the game right now, really laying down a massive amount of hurt when needed, and in some cases holding off an entire room full of chaos warriors when needed, because that's just what the dwarf is: sturdy, tough, reliable, and just a really good friend to have in a fight. So this particular dwarf, I don't know, I've always struggled a little bit with this model. In fact, even as I was deciding to paint it, I spent a lot of time sort of weighing up color schemes and trying to decide on how I want to approach painting a particular model before I start, unfortunately. Well, fortunately or unfortunately, I like to get my thinking out of the way in that sense. I think there was a lot of thinking that I had to put in to try to get this dwarf to where I was happy to work on it as a color scheme. So I'm actually sticking to the original color scheme as best I can, but I'm trying to decide how to apply a color scheme that best suits the dwarf, because he is very small. He's a tiny character relative to the others, and he's liable to not be maybe as eye-catching as the others, because I think more than any of the other miniatures, this character has a bit of a kind of like a chibi sort of deformed. Well, that's a weird way to put it, isn't it? But that's what the Japanese call it. Like chibi means squished, like reduced scale, and therefore a little deformed. What's a good way to put it? To say that he's deformed is a little bit of it sounds kind of negative, I guess. Stylized maybe doesn't quite capture the full extent of what I'm trying to say, but you get the idea, right? Like the dwarf kind of has caricatured features, and I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing, but it does mean that you've got to paint this model with the intent to want to separate all the different parts of the model, paint it for clarity and readability rather than necessarily try to make the model your perfect color scheme. So just to talk about what I'm doing right now, I'm putting on a little bit of red on this trim for his chainmail, because that allows us to really readily see the chainmail more easily. There is a bit of red around the beard beads which are holding them in place. So that's on these guys. The gloves themselves are Eandan yellow, which is just something from the main artwork inspiration, so I'm following that. And then he's got this big cloak. Well, relative to him, it looks big. Plus, he's got, you know, kind of this belt that goes around his belly. Both of these are Pterodon turquoise because I thought a little bit of a bluish color would kind of look good on him. So this model really rewards a little bit of careful planning, just like, well, the dwarf character does in Warhammer Quest. And Warhammer Quest, I once said, I think in a previous video, that you can judge the relative survivability of each character immediately by how much armor they can put on and how much armor they can wear before, you know, they're kind of compromised movement wise and compromised in terms of some other drawback, like there's suits of armor that you can wear that will reduce your weapon skill, for example, because it's just so heavy and inefficient. Dwarves get around a lot of that because they don't suffer a lot of the drawbacks that the less sturdy races get when they wear heavy armor. So it is kind of useful to go shopping for a suit of heavy armor as soon as you can for the dwarf, because I think if you give any party a strong enough position to wedge an enemy group with, you could really shift enemies which are basically well above your pay grade to deal with, because you've got one character you can solidly rely on to kind of soak up damage and to tank the worst of the enemy's attentions. So yeah, the dwarf is really a character that benefits from that kind of thought, that kind of planning. And although the sort of damage output of the dwarf will not immediately show, he does actually benefit from getting very, very solid levels, I believe at level 5 and level 3, at which point he gets weapon skill, attacks, and so on. So yeah, the dwarf, definitely a character you want to try to level up as soon as you can, maybe just after probably the wizard, because having a character that can stand toe-to-toe with some of the harder hitting enemies of Warhammer Quest 95 is definitely a good strategy. He's one of the characters that can probably stand up to a Minotaur, at least for a while, and that kind of flexibility does wonders when you're trying to get your wizard out of a pinch. Plus, because he is so tough, if he gets healed, or if, you know, he draws a lot of aggro, he's able to basically hold on to his wounds a lot better. And so he gives the wizard a bit of a reprieve when it comes to healing other characters. Characters like the barbarian and the wood elf, the elf, have a tendency to be very easy come, easy go with the damage they sustain. So, you know, healing the dwarf always comes across as a slightly better bet, so long as they are able to kind of, you know, control the aggro for enemies around them. So yeah, dwarves, fantastic characters. Not the most exciting to play, I suspect, because essentially they're a melee focused character that goes after most other characters in the game. But eventually there is a lot to love about the dwarf. And in the high battle levels, dwarves absolutely rule the battlefield. They become complete monsters once they get several points of armor, which they can wear with less negative effect. Certain magic items give them benefits that other races do not get, simply because dwarves have an affinity with dwarven made equipment. So dwarves really do come into their own and start shining once they've had a few levels in them and a bit of investment in terms of gold coin into their equipment and gear. Dwarves become every bit the killing monsters that barbarians become. They don't quite become that great at shooting, but in every engagement, you know, you're always going to need somebody to just storm up the middle or else divide an enemy group in half, and dwarves are really good at stopping enemies from dodging past them. In fact, because enemies can never voluntarily dodge past a hero, dwarves become really good at becoming a roadblock for enemy units, and they can really hold up the progress of a large column of, say, Chaos Warriors, for example. So yeah, dwarves, fantastic things. Love them to bits. Glad they're on my side is the best way I would put it. Cool, so I'm going to put in a little bit more silver into the chainmail. So when it comes to painting dwarves, I think one of the most important things to consider is how to paint them effectively in layers, because dwarves generally come in many layers. They have a tendency to be wrapped up in armor to some extent. So in this case, this dwarf has chainmail. Usually for dwarves, Warhammer style, they are either dressed in chainmail or scale mail. Both of these kind of benefit just a very simple treatment, or they look good with a basic treatment of just silver of some description, and then just a targeted non-oil wash, I guess, to keep it silver. And that's basically it. So they look good with a clean, simple color scheme. And yeah, not the most complicated thing in the world to paint, but like I mentioned, because of how small they are and how compact dwarf miniatures tend to be, you tend to need to be careful with how you lay out the colors and plan their execution, so that you have a model that becomes easily readable from afar. I think if you are lacking in care, it's entirely possible to paint a dwarf to look like he's headless, because not only are dwarves shorter than your average miniature, and your average viewer will expect to be looking at a human proportioned character whenever they picked up a miniature. So dwarves have a tendency to be kind of a little bit low, and their heads tend to hang, or at least Games Workshop dwarves anyway, for the most part, tend to have their heads hanging between their shoulders, kind of hunching over, because generally speaking, the sculptors of this earlier era tended to make dwarves look like obese people, who with the very, generally speaking, have a little bit of a hunch or a stoop to their shoulders. That's just how they look, I suppose. And it helps to make sure that when you paint the face, you want to make the face as clear and as visible as possible. So this dwarf in particular has a really nicely sculpted face. It's all cheek, nose, and lips. But most importantly, I think the idea here is to try not to use flesh tones in too many parts of the model, because you want the face to look a little bit unique and special, so that it's visibly easier to pick out. So with that in mind, the little sections of clothing beneath his gloves and where it intersects with the chain, I think I'll just do that in black. The reason why I put a blob of off-white over here is actually because that's part of his beard. And yeah, I'm gonna grab this and hit it with a hairdryer now, because wet pools that I want to work around. Okay, so just a sec. Okay, now everything's nice and dry. I think it's time to come back in and to apply some of the other colors around this model. For the scabbard of his knife, I am using Gorgrunter fur. This is a nice kind of dark mahogany color, very rich looking. That kind of gives a little bit of depth for this part of the miniature. I find dwarves have a tendency, generally speaking, to be designed as if they were either Celts, vaguely Gaelic looking with winged helmets and so on, or else they tend to be done up as Vikings, in which case they've got that sort of cartoony Viking look of having horns. I know real life Vikings didn't wear horn helmets, but I think that look kind of sticks. So fantasy Vikings essentially, or fantasy Gauls, and they both look good in my opinion. Just both ways can be nice. It's just a case of using colors that sort of suit that theme. This dwarf is, to my mind at least, very clearly of the Gaelic dwarf variety. I think what you have is a bunch of parts that very much echoes the look of Vercingetorix actually. At least the way he's depicted in a lot of artwork. So he's got a big bushy beard, full beard and mustache, of course, is traditional for a dwarf at least. but he's also got like a long cloak, as well as chainmail that's kind of edged with some kind of fabric. And he's got an elaborate sort of hairstyle. Clearly he takes a lot of care in his appearance. And yeah, just an overall great looking miniature. So I've done his pouch, his belt, his bag over there, no doubt full of magic items, flash powder and the like. And now I'm moving on to the wooden stock of his axe. Now, although it might make sense for a dwarf to use, I guess, metallic materials to kind of form the haft of his weapons, I still feel that the eye naturally understands, or the viewer naturally understands wood if it's made out of, you know, or rather axe hafts if they're made out of wood, because I think that's just something that we're used to. It's best not to think too hard about whether or not that might stand up to the kind of abuse that a dwarf puts his weapon through. But certainly it works on some level, and I guess it might have a couple of runes of resilience or runes of long lasting or something like that to sort of augment their effectiveness. So yeah, this is Nazdreg yellow, which gives you a kind of a nice light amber kind of look, which I think works particularly well with the more or less naturalistic palette of this dwarf. Next, we're going to go and do that glorious eagle feathered headdress that he's got on his helmet. In the original artwork, this was done in black, which is a very unconventional choice as far as I'm concerned. I do want to try to emulate it to some extent though, because I really like the look of the dwarf in the original artwork. I believe this was done by Dave Gallagher, and I think Dave Gallagher's really done quite a remarkable job using a muted palette of colors. It's very much reminiscent of Dwarf and Squad. Is it Orc and Squad Warlords, which is the epic expansion, epic Space Marine expansion. The cover art for that expansion essentially had a dwarf. Ooh, that looks a bit dire actually. I need to go and dry that off. Just a second. Sorry guys, while waxing lyrical about Dwarf and Squad Warlords, well, I keep saying Dwarfs, Orcs and Squad Warlords, I kind of let a bit of the, I guess, Nazdreg yellow run onto the Gryphcharger grey that I was using to block in his helmet. No matter, we will live with this and we will move on. Cool, so I want to just make sure that it's bluish enough that this serves as an undercolor for the noun oil that I will be painting over this in layers. I want to try to avoid doing highlights if I can on this miniature, because these feathers are just really fine, and it might be a bit of a hassle to try to get, you know, a highlight tone on each and every single one of these feathers. So much like, you know, the way we plan for highlights when we paint chest eagles on Space Marines. Generally speaking, you want to make sure that if you intend for the model to kind of have a lighter edge highlight kind of look, you might want to start with a lighter color and then gradually build up the shades, as opposed to hitting it with a contrast paint that's too dark and will completely obliterate any so-called highlights that you might want to have. So let's just leave this to dry a little bit, and then we'll start to fix some of the weird areas that got a little bit of Nazdreg yellow into them. Not a big deal, we'll just fix that later. Let's jump right in to some Black Templar. So dropping this onto the dwarf's boots and onto the underside of his clothing as well, just to keep that dark and just kind of not too visible. The dwarves of this era are really just torsos, aren't they? Very often you don't get to see, well, mercifully at least, you don't get to see the undercarriage of a dwarf. Probably something that's best left to the imagination, if I'm to be honest. You don't necessarily want to look under a dwarf's hem, and if you did, it might be the last thing that you'll ever see. I do actually have a miniature of perhaps the only female dwarf ever to be sculpted, which was a character from Grudge of Drong, and I would love to paint that at some point. So stay tuned for a future episode where I get to cover that miniature, because it is quite, I mean, it's not that remarkable, I suppose. I mean, certainly a female dwarf kind of looks like a male dwarf for the most part, but without a beard, kind of like a cross between a dwarf and a halfling for this era of Games Workshop's dwarf aesthetic. But I thought it was an interesting enough model that I would want to definitely paint it, because it's just so rare that you get to see a female dwarf sculpted and released by Games Workshop. So yeah, let's do that. Should be good fun. To my knowledge, I think the only other female dwarf ever to be released was a Dwarven cheerleader for Blood Bowl 2nd edition. I believe. I might be missing out something else. But yeah, I think that's something that, you know, it's worthy of note and should be a lot of fun to paint. So this dwarf has nice dark boots and not much else to pick out really, other than his beard. He's got a little bit of a hem of clothing. He's got a bit of a hem that goes around, kind of like an underskirt underneath his chainmail. So we'll do that maybe in a blue, which is traditional. So what I found as I perused through more earlier Games Workshop materials is, generally speaking, when the Citadel design team basically run sort of colors for the treatment of a particular army, or else they do an army that's not incredibly known for a specific color. So say, for example, it's very rare to find a dark elf that's not painted purple, and it's very rare for a high elf to not feature some kind of white. I have found that they've got a tendency to make the model essentially all colors of the rainbow. So in the case of this dwarf, as is the case with many other dwarves from many other expansions, whether in 40k or in fantasy, what they would do is they just go right ahead and do the dwarf in every single color you can imagine. So you have a real red, blue, green, yellow kind of color scheme. In case you're getting alarmed at what I'm doing right now, what I'm trying to do is to basically reset the base coat, or the undercoat, sorry, of silver gray, Vallejo silver gray, for the model in areas that were hit by the Nazdreg yellow. And then when this is fully dry, I will go over it with a little bit more Gryphcharger grey, and then that would look a lot better. So let's hope for that. Let's come back in with a little bit more Eandon yellow to make sure that the gloves are nicely defined. And then after that, we can jump right in with a bit of a highlight using ice yellow. You can see my puddle of ice yellow just quivering menacingly there on my wet palette. Can you see it? Perhaps you can. There we go, over there, so you know where I'm headed with that. And yeah, I think he's looking pretty good so far. Now let's jump in and define some of the gold, add a bit of warmth back into this color scheme. Sorry, I realized I missed a spot with Gryphcharger Grey, so let's just hit that for now. Yeah, so let's grab a bit of gold. The moment you paint gold on a dwarf, I think the dwarf miniature starts to come together really beautifully. Simply because dwarves look like a mass of silver because they just have so much metallic colors on the surface that once you start to put this in, it really greatly affects the color scheme of a dwarf miniature. So I am dropping my typical gold mix, which is Seraphim Sepia plus Nazdreg yellow, and applying this over the surface of all of the silver areas, letting it, you know, kind of pool a little bit. I'm applying it generously but not slopping it all over the surface. If I want more intensity and more depth, I can always come back and do a second coat, this time emphasizing the lower half of it. So yeah, there's no need to go overboard with the initial application. You just want to have a little bit such that you've got an interesting gradation in color. So for example here, by applying a little bit in excess of what I would typically do for such a flat surface, I'm able to get a really nice kind of line and sort of capture the concavity of that lower part of the pommel, right? So likewise, when I do his forehead sigil, a little bit of care means that I can preserve the inner part of his helmet, sort of like the under structure of his helmet, and I can do that in silver, so I can have a two-tone helmet, which adds a lot of clarity to the color scheme, and helps make the miniature a lot easier to read. Like I said, dwarves are fairly small, and their stature is kind of, well, frankly, a little bit inhuman, so it helps to carefully define these locations such that it can be picked up by eye a lot easier. So that's our dwarf. He's coming along nicely, and I am happy with the way he's developing. Now he's got this glorious decoration on his axe that absolutely screams out to be picked out in gold, because who else but a dwarf would have such an ostentatious axe? And this is where the sort of Celtic Gaelic look of the dwarf looks, you know, most obvious. This is practically the legendary films icon. Also looks potentially vaguely Chinese if you know, you recognize those shapes and forms. But yeah, this is the most iconically Gaelic looking bit of decoration I've ever seen, and I think it looks amazing when you pick it out like this. Yeah, so I think that looks pretty good. We'll let that dry. In the meantime, we'll do the other side. With contrast paints, I think it's really good, or other translucent brands of paint, for example, Express Paint by Vallejo, or Speed Paints by the Army Painter. You want to make sure that when you apply your colors, you kind of don't overwork them on the surface. Apply them quickly and briefly, and then kind of leave the surface to do its thing. And you'll find that the paint will level itself out. It will pool where it needs to be. Your job is really just to make sure that you've put the correct amount of paint on the surface such that it can level itself off and gradate on the surface beautifully. And if you've put too much paint, to sort of wick off the excess before it's allowed to do that. So if you put the exact correct amount of paint on the surface of the model, then your colors will sort of spread over the surface correctly, and you'll have a model that, you know, looks, at least to the eye, to have at least a basic sort of base coat, as well as the beginnings, the suggestion of a highlight. And I think that looks really, really good on the axe, right? So let's come back in with a little bit of Ultramarines blue to do his fabric. And I favor Ultramarines blue because it's a little bit more desaturated. I think with this model, there is already a lot of saturation going on. Like the red is really bright, the yellow is really bright on his gloves. Kind of really like how his gloves have that feel of construction equipment. The feel of construction equipment. I think that's really cute. And you can sort of see the effect that making the blue a little bit more understated has on the overall look of the miniature. I've also noticed that And of course, I have forgotten to put Nazdreg yellow on the top of this axe. This will be where you would have the shims hammered into the top to secure the axe. Unfortunately, that detail isn't sculpted on this dwarf, but you know, that's fine. I think it might come across as confusing to people who aren't familiar with how an axe is put together in real life. That's fine. And then we can come back in and very quickly resolve with Gryphcharger Grey the areas where we made a mistake earlier. Like so. And then just to finish off the wings, because the wings on the model, I probably misspoke by calling them eagle wings. I guess I just called them eagle wings because they're so large and impressive. Probably these are more like raven wings? I don't know. But in the original artwork, Dave Gallagher did them fairly dark. No, not the second time. I'm gonna stop this, nip this in the bud. No unauthorized running of Nazdreg yellow today, please. Sir. There we go. Okay. Yeah, because dwarves are kind of small, there is a danger that, you know, paint, if you're not careful, just like I wasn't too careful just now, paint can kind of run everywhere if you let it. So now for his beard. So the original color in the artwork was whites, and painting a white beard is kind of tricky. I like painting beards white because I think it's a really strong focal point for a miniature that really benefits with, like I said, having very clearly defined details. But painting white can be a little bit of a challenge. Now I do have the benefit of having this silver gray base coat / undercoat to work from. It's a base coat essentially because I don't intend to apply a base coat over it, so this is effectively our base coat at this point, over which we apply our shading and highlights. And what I'm doing is I'm just very carefully adding a little bit of Gryphcharger Grey. Now work carefully with it, and like without sort of letting it thicken on your palette too much, and you'll find that it can come across as a bit translucent, which is exactly what you want, because it makes it easier to blend into the surface. So I'm just making sure that we've got a little bit of this bluish tinge where the beard meets the face, because that's where you would expect a little bit of the bluish color to be visible. And I think he doesn't look too bad. Now a little bit of color for these lines underneath his chin, and I think that beard is starting to look decent. We'll definitely come in to apply a pure white highlight to give him that true Santa Claus kind of appearance. But for now, I think that's kind of taking us in the right direction, so long as we cover all the traditional shadow areas in the recesses of his beard. Cool! Some bits definitely need a bit of a cleanup, you know, where in particular there is a little bit of red encroaching onto the beard. That's not intended. We'll fix that when the time comes. And then now, with most of the colors on this model done, I think it's time to jump in with a little bit of Nuln Oil. And this is where I think I need to be extremely careful again to make sure that I don't create a huge mess. So if Nuln Oil would be so kind as to show up. Searching. There we go, Nuln Oil. So Nuln Oil, modern Nuln Oil is a little bit too light for my taste. I like to take it and put a bit of Black Legion in to darken it to the point of old school Nuln Oil. So this is what I realized I missed that. So sorry guys. Now is a good time to jump back in with a bit of my gold mix, Nazdreg Yellow and Seraphim Sepia, to sketch out this area. And before we proceed any further, maybe a little bit more targeted shading with this color to make some of these areas of inlay filigree even better design, even better defined, sorry, not designed. Yeah, although they are certainly very well designed in my opinion, because this is an apex dwarf. Excellent miniature, perfectly readable, very dwarfy, and frankly light on unnecessary details. Cool. I'm gonna give that a little time to dry, a little bit of time to dry, because I did kind of just apply paint nearby. So I'm just gonna jump into the chainmail areas to give them a small amount of definition that they require. Basically, you just want to apply noun oil just enough to start to see the little pock marks where the indents of the chainmail are. No more, no less. There's no need to overdo this stage, because it is quite effective enough, thank you very much. And you actually want the silver to still have a little bit of its original shine. While you're at it, because this is essentially a very light black wash, what you can do is you can apply it over areas where a little bit more emphasis and separation will go a long way towards making the model more readable. So for example, I would take the time to say apply it over parts of the raven wings, I guess, I don't know, they're black, and in the original artwork they are surprisingly dark as well. Not that that's a bad thing, I actually quite like the look of it this way. But yeah, so that's sort of inner frame or inner structure of his helmet. Sorry if this is a little bit hard to see, I'll try to angle it for a better view. Yeah, so over here, can you see? I hope you can. And yeah, I think that looks kind of alright. And then we're moving over his axe, starting with the rivets, and then being extremely careful where they touch the gold areas, because what you want to do is you want to make sure that there's a little bit of a black outline, or noun oil outline rather, around these areas, but you don't want them to take over the gold surface. Now a little bit of back and forth might be needed to make sure that this line is nice and hard and sharp. But essentially what you're trying to do is to make it so the gold wash, the sort of Nazdreg yellow and Seraphim Sepia wash line is overlain by a black wash line from the noun oil, and in so doing you've got double the sort of definition, as the washes work well one on top of the other to harden that line visually to make it more distinct. And what you don't want to do is to have areas where you've only got the yellow line, the yellow sort of gold shade line showing, and I think it's okay to have just black, but what you're trying to do is to make sure that it's strong enough to separate visually these two areas, because we definitely want to have the look of a component that's kind of a composite material. You want the actual basic axe underneath, right? The axe blade underneath, the working surface, that sort of bright silver color. And then you want to see the gold inlay stand out nice and sharp from it. So you've got that kind of like twice the interest. So that's a beautiful thing about dwarf weapons, right? Sculpted by Games Workshop. They have a tendency to feature lots of points of interest, and they can be very, very appealing to paint if a little bit fiddly, if the inlay is done very shallowly, done in a very shallow sort of manner, as is the case with a lot of later miniatures. You want to be especially careful, because as the detail got very, very, very fine and became a lot less chunky, it became a lot easier to also fill in those gaps with the wrong wash color, or else miss out on defining the margins correctly, and therefore the model starts to look a little bit muddy and indistinct. Nothing wrong with this. I think it's just a side effect of basically computer aided design. It has a tendency to shrink things down as opposed to miniatures of this era, which I believe were sculpted by hand and then digitally corrected after scanning. This is in fact a plastic miniature. They were designed specifically for the Warhammer Quest box, and they kind of have a uniqueness. They kind of have a flavor, a sort of creative design, creative direction that is clearly different from almost any other game. Certainly, you would go a long time before you saw a Norse barbarian ever again in miniature form, and it was a long time before you saw a dwarf that was this, I guess, stylized and interesting looking. I, for one, am quite a fan of this particular dwarf sculpt. I think it's hard to appreciate when you kind of look at the raw sculpt without colors on it. It kind of looks a little bit truncated and weird, but the more you look at it when you paint, and the more you add colors to help visually separate the different zones on the miniature, the more you realize what a masterpiece of design balance is on display with this miniature. Because I think it's very likely that the miniature could have kind of gone a little off the rails if they weren't careful with how they balanced all the various details, and I really appreciate this miniature for that. So anyway, we're coming in to start to apply the first highlights for the cloak. Basically areas that would catch the light naturally, so a little bit on the back here. As is usually my preference, I go in fairly strong with highlights, because the reasoning is that I can always come back in and sort of like blend them in a little bit with a glaze afterwards. But I like to immediately see an impact when I apply my highlights on. So I think that looks pretty good actually. And then we want to spend a little bit more time on the glorious yellow gloves. So this is pure ice yellow as promised, and I think what we want to do is to try to sort of define the edges as well as areas where the material of this, what I assume to be a fairly thick leather, because of how few folds and creases there are in it, have kind of crinkled together from the articulation of the model's hand, of the dwarf's hand at the wrist, and therefore the model looks better once you put a couple of lines of ice yellow, simply because it is in line with the way our brains understand this material to work under the stress of motion. Fingers, a little bit on the bright side, but I think that helps to define them and make them nice and sharp. We also want to put little spots of ice yellow on the fingertips, because that defines the fingertips the way we understand them. And one last set of dots or lines, dashes really when you think about it, highlighting the knuckles, and that gives the fist shape, direction, and a sense of tension, because it emphasizes how tightly the miniature is clenching his fist. So again, knuckles for this side, you want to do essentially the individual finger bones, the metatarsals and tarsals, and then focus on the knuckles and not basically the main part of the finger, just the knuckles. And you'll find that this ring indicates that our dwarf is married, because it appears to be on his ring finger, assuming dwarven society works like human society, and they wear rings on their ring finger, or if it's just something that you use to create a prettier pattern on the face of the next orc that you punch. That sounds more like a dwarf thing, perhaps. Maybe that's just what dwarves prefer. But yeah, so I think that looks pretty good, if a little bright. I might come in and sort of glaze some more Iyanden yellow, but I haven't decided whether I need that yet or not. I think it looks nice and bright, which is how I like my dwarf gloves. So yeah. Sorry, Mr. Dwarf, for prying into your marital status. That business is your own. So there. I'm gonna grab a bit of our original silver grey and wrong color. A bit of our silver grey and mix that into, if I can find it, is that our color? No, I think this is the one. Okay, cool. So a bit of silver grey mixed into our black Templar from earlier, and then we're just gonna apply a very simple highlight on his boots. I imagine that having nice shiny boots is probably a matter of pride amongst dwarves, because a dwarf would reason that if they're gonna die, at least they will die well dressed. Dapper little fellows. All business, but that doesn't mean they're no fun. Yeah, so there's a glorious practicality about this miniature, right? There's little, if any, extraneous detail. Everything kind of in its own place and occupying pride of place, therefore easy to pick apart visually when looking at this model from a distance. That to me makes for an ideal dwarf miniature, rather than one that's kind of muddy on details or a little bit non-conformist with anatomy. This dwarf's anatomy is a mystery, and I think that's just fine. It's just that it needs to be readable from a distance, and that would make it ideal. Cool, so I'm going to come in with white now, and I'm going to be very carefully applying some highlights on his beard. You should always take the utmost care when doing anything with a dwarf's beard, because somebody's going to get hurt real bad if that's not the case. So we have our undercoat silver grey, which is an off-white color, kind of ideal for applying a quick wash onto with Gryphcharger grey to create a kind of bluish shaded grey, and then after that coming in with pure white just to add the highlights, and we are creating a little bit of texture by not being too clean with our brush strokes. But always making sure that, you know, we respect the direction of flow for the hairs. Sorry guys, I had a weird hair, speaking of which, on my brush. Yeah, so we want to always make sure that, you know, the hair follows a preset pattern. He's got these beautiful braids that we can sort of pick out point by point using our brush. And then wherever you've got a little bit of hair on the end, be sure to kind of stipple on the color a little bit. Stipple on the whites a little bit to make sure that it's nice and clear, sort of like textured and complex. And ensure that it is bright from every angle, because dwarf's beard is his pride and not to be messed around with. Not unless, of course, you're willing to go to war with the entire dwarf empire at this stage. It's always been a bit of an interesting kind of concept to me that most of the dark places of the Warhammer world that dwarfs actually explore might once have belonged to scions of their own kingdom, right? Because the truth is, so much of the understructure of the earth of the Warhammer world underground is built by the dwarves, because the dwarves live for a long time and they build things to last. So when you delve into the bowels of the Warhammer world, really for a dwarf it might just be coming home. You know, you might just be walking into his element, and frankly I want to have someone like that by my side when I'm facing some of the worst monsters you can imagine to meet in the darkness. I think there was a specific white dwarf article by Thomas Pirinen. Love you, by the way, Thomas. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. But there was a phrase, something along the lines of when the chips are down and minotaurs abound, it's good to have a dwarf by your side. And I, for one, wholeheartedly agree with that. I might have completely misquoted. More than likely, I've misquoted the writer of that particular rhyme. But it's an excellent line. And I, for one, am happy that there is a dwarf in my party. Get you a dwarf in your party that makes minotaurs look like the big furry babies they are. Cool. Last little bit over here on his strappy strap. And I think we're doing pretty good. I want to do a little bit of a highlight on the deep blue areas of his nether fabric. His skirt, essentially. That's what I was trying to get at. Just to make sure that this is a little bit more visible. I hope you can see what I'm doing. Sorry if I'm out of frame. Trying to get better at that. Trying to get better at recording videos that actually show, like recording painting videos that actually show you painting, rather than stuff that, you know, is completely out of focus. So checking more regularly with my display. Who's a handsome man? There's something very satisfying about painting dwarves in this way. Basically, he gets more and more defined over time, right? So as you kind of refine some of the areas to make them a little bit more readable, in a way the dwarf kind of emerges. The dwarf within. And the miniature starts to become a lot more clear and visible, which is kind of great. I have no idea where I was going with that, so let's just stick with it. Yeah. Cool. Bit of red to pick out that gem on his ring. Let's do it red. Maybe red is the color of elf blood, and therefore this ring represents his grudge with the elven kingdoms and nothing to do with marriage, like I previously suggested. Okay, I think he's looking pretty good. So a last bit of a highlight on his face, very carefully, on his nose and top of his cheeks. I'm not going to paint his eyes. First of all, because the model isn't sculpted with any eyes, and second of all, because as a dwarf, clearly his face is scrunched up with rage. Therefore, you can't see his eyes because he's clearly spotted some orc and goblin shenanigans in the distance, in the gloom, that only his ancient eyes can see. And all the humans are just going to have to follow as best they can as our dwarf hero carves a red wake through their numbers and ranks, laughing gleefully at every grudge that he's able to strike off his book of grudges. Because, my friends, that is what the dwarf do. That is how the dwarf do. So a little bit of Nuln oil, carefully, to selectively darken parts of his beard in the recesses, just as I mentioned, as part of this continued endeavor to try to ensure that the model is as readable as possible, just to define all the little dark shadows and spots. Be wary in particular of where, you know, we've got the gold edging the white of his beard, because it can very easily have the look of a spilled ale on your beard if you've got like streaks of yellow creeping across, and that will be acceptable to no dwarf at all, especially not this handsome lad. So a bit more, I believe a little bit more Nuln oil to better define the edges of his decoration on his axe. Now the axe is such an important part of the miniature, plus the axe is at least as big as he is, right? As big as his torso is. So it makes sense to try to spend a little bit more time to get the axe looking its best, since it is such a significant part of the miniature and such a significant part of dwarf culture, right? So there. So a little bit more time spent channeling the Nuln oil onto the axe to where it needs to be. I actually don't mind dwarven axes being a little bit darker than, you know, the sort of steel that you see on human weapons, because just as you've got Ithilma, which is the elf kind of metal, the named elf metal, looking kind of bright and shiny because it's a reference to the Lord of the Rings, of course. I kind of like the idea that dwarf equipment is kind of sooty, you know, sooty and rough and ready, but of insanely high quality. I just think that suits the dwarf mindset more. It's really function over aesthetics that to me feels just very dwarfy and very appropriate for a warrior who is serious about the business of killing and liberating his dungeon fastness from the likes of the scum of the earth, be you Skaven, Beastmen, or the hated Groby. And I swear there's no other kind of miniature that gets me into this sort of mood when painting. Dwarfs are great. Okay, so I think that's where I'm gonna leave it. I think he's got a good look about him. I could, sorry, the temptation of applying a little bit more Eandan yellow to kind of blend in the ice yellow a little bit more around the highlights was too strong. I apologize. But a dwarf rewards careful, considered detailing, and I can sort of see myself adding a lot more detail to this chap over time. But for now, I'm going to have to call it. I think he looks great. I hope you agree. And yeah, this little boy is ready to go into the dark places of the old world. You know, bringing up the rear of his warband, of his little party of 4, but being an integral part of it nonetheless. Alright guys, have a good one. Cheers, hope you had a good time watching. Like, comment, subscribe, all that great stuff if you enjoyed the video. I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye.